Hey everyone, welcome to our workshop. So today I'm going to be explaining Intro to CNNs or convolutional neural networks. So what are CNNs? They're basically a convolutional neural network that's used in machine learning tasks. For example, in trying to classify or recognize images. They can say, this is yellow, this is blue. They can say, this is a data line, this is a rose. And they can also identify sounds as well. For example, by saying, this is a car horn or this is a music sound. And lastly, they can be used for image recognition. If we feed the CNN skin cancer images, it can then identify the skin cancer types. For example, this is a basal cell carcinoma image, or this is a melanoma image. Here's another example of CNN models. Here, to identify that a number is 3, a CNN processes these images of different numbers, trying to identify these patterns, shapes, and edges. For example, a 7 and 3, the difference is a 7 has a sort of long string line, while a 3 has two curves. Basically, it wants to know these features, so then it can identify what number is what. Then the CNN can classify each number and recognize them by their shapes. Here's what CNN looks like. It has input layers, hidden layers, and outputs. These circles are called neurons, and these neurons connect together and work together to learn features and patterns of input data. For example, the number of 3. The input in this case would be the input data, for example, images of different numbers. Basically, the hidden layers try to calculate and identify and learn all the patterns from input data. For example, they see the 3 has two curves, and 8 has two curves, but also they close the curves. A 1 is only one straight line. So here's some examples of how they try to identify all these features of the input data. Lastly, the output produces the vector of class labels. This is basically saying it's going to produce a long string of numbers that correspond to the category of input. For example, if the inputs were cats and dogs, the output could be zeros and ones. Zeros correspond to cats and one correspond to dogs. In this case, it will say 0 is a cat, 1 is a dog, for example. And that's basically trying to classify the categories of images. So here is a CNN framework that's using Python, for example, and we're going to be going through a Python demonstration further on. Basically, the steps to train a CNN would be first to find, import, and process a data set. So for example, if we have a cat and dog data set, we would then import that into our environment or notebook, for example, and then we split the data into X and Y. This basically means that we want to split the data into X, which are the actual images of data, and Y, which are the labels. For example, in this case, the X would be the pictures of cats and dogs, and the Y would be the labels, the names, cats and dogs. Further on, we have to split the data set into training and testing. In this case, for example, 80% of the data set could be used for training and 20% is used for testing. This is important to try to train the model beforehand before we then make it test it on the data set. This is very similar to try to study for a math test. We first want to study for the math test by trying to memorize the formulas and also do practice problems before we do the actual test. And this can help us increase our testing accuracy, which is basically the motive or goal of training a CNN model. So that's basically the step of training and running the model. At the very end, we'll evaluate the accuracy or the outputs of the models. In this case, we want to see how accurate the model is to identify each image to its correct category. Basically, for example, the baseline could be 90% or above. It basically means we want to identify correctly 90% of the images that we feed the model into. So basically, the CNN tries to learn features of the input data that's indicative of certain categories. The CNN has a kernel or filter, which is this square that scans over the features of the input data, and they generate a feature map. And each of its hidden layers increase the complexity of the data features. Basically, it's trying to say we want to first scan over all the features and then identify the most important features of these input data. And then we can then learn all these sort of features. And lastly, we can produce an output. Here is a notebook for the CNN model demonstration. To get started, we first have to enable GPUs, which are needed to make models run faster in Google Colab. So here, if we check right here, we see that we do have a GPU, so we are all set. Basically, these GPUs, they help speed up model training, which is good if you want to save time as well. So first, we have to import the important libraries, basically most likely and most importantly, the TensorFlow libraries and also the matplotlib libraries. TensorFlow is basically these libraries, they have the parts of the CNN models, and they're important so that we can then use those parts in order to form the framework and also the code for CNN models. For example, we have keras, layers, sequential, etc. Next, we also have matplotlib, which is important to create graphs of the accuracies at the very end of the CNN model training. After we import all the libraries, we then go into the data set. CFAR10 is basically a free online data set that has 10 categories of different animals and cars, for example. And here we want to load the data set and also split it into training and testing. So here's the code for doing that. And here we try to assign the class labels and visualize the data. So here in this case, we have these 10 categories that the model needs to try to identify between. And here we also visualize the data as well. So here we plot a sum of the data into the code so we can see what kind of data is in our data set. Here we also use the matplotlib library to try to sort of generate the pictures of the data set. So basically here, if we see below, here are some of the pictures that are in the CFAR10 dataset. They're not very clear, but basically they are still recognizable. So with our human eyes, we can still tell that this is a car, this is a horse, for example. And we want to train the CNN model to sort of model how we see data. So we want to say, we want to see how well the CNN can also see this data, even though they're very unclear, because we want to see how accurate it can become when the images are clear versus not clear, etc. We want to try to make it more robust so that no matter how clear the images are, the CNN can identify what kind of category these images belong into. So here is the sort of trying to assign the classes and also trying to visualize the data as well. So here's basically that step. The next step is to code the model architecture. So first, to get started, we use the sequential method. And that leads into adding the layers of the models. So here we have a com2D model. This one includes an input shape. Basically, these data sets, to make it sort of more recognizable and easier for the model, we want to make sure all the images are in the same input shape. In this case, there's 32 by 32. That's like the size of most of the images. And we also put 3 because 3 is basically for colored images. If we put 1 there, we're basically saying the data set we're feeding in is going to be a grayscale or all gray images. But because we have the colors RGB, red, blue, green, we can use 3 for the input color channel. Here we have 32 because this is the size of the com2D layer. These are basically mostly arbitrary numbers, except for we want to make it usually a power of 2. So 16, 32, 64, etc. Here's basically the size of the kernel size. Like I mentioned before, a kernel is a square that scans over all the features of input data. In this case, our kernel will be 3 by 3 in size. That's basically usually a baseline good sort of number to use for a kernel size. Next is the max pooling layer. Max pooling is interesting because it does almost the same thing as a com2D, except for it downsamples, which means that it only keeps the most important features. While the com2D model, or while the com2D layer, it sort of tries to find the most important features. Max pooling finds those features, but shrinks it down so that it only keeps and retains the most important features for the model. This makes the model train faster and also makes sure to reduce a little bit of complexity, or else the training would be taking like way too long. Here we repeat the layers to create different layers of CNNs. To make the entire model more complex, we can repeat layers like this. Next, we have dropout. So dropout is basically it drops connections between the neurons. As you can see in this image right here, we have all these orange arrows that connect the neurons together, sort of like in a human brain, so they can all learn from each other and sort of send data around. So here we want to drop some connections because this helps reduce memorization and increase learning. For example, in a math test, we don't want to memorize all the answers to questions. We want to learn all the formulas, learn all the concepts. Same thing here. We want the CNN to stop memorizing much and try to more learn so that it can then do better on the actual test. For example, if we only memorize the answers to questions for a math test on the actual test, if they have different questions, it can lead to a lower accuracy. Same thing here. If the CNN memorizes all the features only, if we give it different images, it can be very inaccurate for testing, which is why we want the model to learn more, learn the generalized features, so that no matter what kind of image we give it, it can then identify the image during testing. This makes the testing accuracy higher. So here, after that would be the flatten layer. Flatten basically converts all these 2D layers. These are all 2D. These are 2D because our images are 2D images, two-dimensional images, which is why they're all 2D. So here the flatten converts 2D layers into a 1D layer. A 1D layer, basically here we have vectors of sort of numbers that correspond to the labels. For example, like I mentioned before, if we have cats and dogs only, the labels could be like zeros and ones. Zeros could be cats and ones could be dogs. Here is trying to produce a classification, prediction, and output label for that. After that, we have the dense layer. The dense layer is basically the most complex layer of the CNN. It basically has these neurons that are very connected within themselves, making it very dense. It has all these neurons that come together. They try to find the most important and also the best forms of the features that the model has learned so far, combining everything together. At the very end, we have the dense layer again. But in this case, this is sort of more for the number of categories. Because the CFAR10 dataset has 10 categories, we put 10 for the very last sort of layer of the model. And after that, we basically have the entire model. And then we can then see these layers by doing model.summary. This produces an output of the layers of the CNN model. So here we have these ones that we talked about so far, and we also sort of see the parameters as well. This is basically the size of the model. In this case, we have around 100,000 parameters. That's sort of small because some models can be 1 million parameters, etc. But because our model or because our data set is kind of small, it's fine to have a smaller model. So after that, we will be training the model. So here we have compiling and then trying to fit the model. Compile is trying to find the most important optimizers, the different sort of selections of things that make the model get ready for training. So here we set the metrics to accuracy because we want to find the accuracy of the model. We have this sparse categorical cross entropy. This is basically saying for this sort of task, this is called categorical because we want to find the categories of the images. We'll be using that loss because we're trying to find the categories of the image. Different types of tasks will require a different loss, different metric, etc. These are basically settings that get the model ready for training. Next, we fit the model, which is basically the training step and also the testing step. Here we basically feed in the training images, training labels, testing images, and testing labels. Training images are the images used for training. Training labels are the names of these images used for training. And then here for testing, the same thing. We have the actual images along with the labels or the category names. Here we'll be running it for 20 epochs. I ran it before because it takes kind of long to run through each step live. So I ran this before the workshop. Basically 20 epochs means that we'll be running it 20 times. The model will be splitting the data set into 20 parts. It'll be seeing these 20 batches one at a time to try to find and sort of learn the data in order to classify the data at the very end. As you can see, this code block produced this type of output. As you can see, for each epoch, it ran for around 8 seconds. This basically shows how fast the model is. For example, it will be in 8 seconds, it can then identify the features, identify all the little shapes of the images, so then it can then produce a correct output. Here we have the loss and accuracy for training and the loss and accuracy for testing. Loss basically shows us what sort of data that the model classified incorrectly. Accuracy measures how much the model has classified correctly. Here, as we can see, the accuracy is rising, which is a good thing, showing that our model is learning. However, our model did sort of stop right here. It kind of plateaus. This basically shows us that the model is not sort of learning as well as we wanted to, but it is still improving. So in this case, we have around 80% for training and 70% for testing accuracy. Usually the training accuracy would be higher than testing because usually the training is a little bit easier on the model. So the training is 80% accurate, while the testing is around 70% accurate in this case. Here we evaluate the performance of the model. Here, for example, we plot the data using matplotlib. Here's basically the library we use, matplotlib, to kind of plot the performance. Here we produce a graph of the accuracy. It basically has the x-axis as epoch, and then the y-axis as accuracy from a scale of 0 or from 0.5 to 1. So here's we can see the validation accuracy is increasing. The accuracy for the training accuracy for the model is also increasing as well. However, the validation accuracy or testing accuracy did plateau a little bit, showing the model has not been learning as well as we wanted to. So here we think that if I were to make the epochs bigger, for example, if I were to run it for 100 epochs, maybe the validation accuracy would increase a little bit. So here we can also print out the final accuracy in numbers. If you run this code, it will produce 0.72. This tells us the very last or the most average testing accuracy so far. This basically means our model is currently 70% accurate. And basically from there, I'll be sending out the slides as well and posting it down below. So here you guys can try this Google Colab on your own as well. And that's about it. Thank you for listening.